Let us begin. Our next speaker is Tom Palmer, Vice President of Atlas Foundation, the American foundation involved in dissemination of ideas around which were gathered at our Free Generation Forum, the ideas of free market, freedom, and all these ideas for Mr. Palmer are the work of his life. He is involved in this for more than for decades. He tries to promote this in all continents of our planet. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Mr. Palmer was one of the first economists, political scientists, philosophers to visit and the former republics. They looked at how it works, it doesn't work, and they tried to give advice how to build a society on a freedom basis.
So after the lecture, you will have an opportunity to ask some questions. You can do it in English, in Russian, in Ukrainian. So Mr. Palmer will have a translation. So, Mr. Tom Palmer.
Thank you very much, Sergey, and my apologies. I've worked in Russia and Ukraine for years, but my Russian and my Ukrainian would bring tears to your eyes if I tried. Originally, I was going to talk on opening Ukraine and becoming more global and open. But my colleague Johan Norberg from Sweden will talk about that. And we discussed, I will address something a little different. The need for idealism and realism at the same time. Now, sometimes people say you must choose. You can be an idealist or a realist. Idealism is high-minded. Realism is low-minded. Idealism is moralistic. Realism, just practical. Idealism, unobtainable. Realism is about obtainable. And idealism is just for the dreamers, whereas realism is for serious people. I think that's a mistake. We don't have to choose between being idealists and being realists. And if you want to be successful, you have to be both at the same time. Ukraine needs people who are both idealistic and realistic. People who have high moral ideals of honesty and integrity and justice, and they're very practical. You need to be moral and practical. You need to be dreamers, and you need to be serious people at the same time. Now, you know that your country is in great danger. You know better than most people in the world the danger that you face. Territory has been annexed by another state. Armed conflict has killed many thousands of your fellow citizens. And economic life is suffering. There has been a reduction in living standards for Ukrainian people. Now, the economic data only tell a part of the story. This was from the last month, and people have focused on this. This looks like good news, that there's some kind of a recovery. But do realize the context. Ukraine went backward. Ukraine is poorer now. And it will take time for this recovery, if it continues, to generate a prosperous country that people want to live in. Now, free market reforms are not just idealistic or moral. They are also very practical. And I will give some case studies of how idealists who were practical changed their countries and saved them from catastrophe. If you want to look at the big picture, you can go to freetheworld.com. The Fraser Institute of Canada has created a giant database covering many decades of economic policy and economic performance. It is very open source. You can be critical, you can download the data, you can combine it with other data sets. If you're very statistically minded, you can run regressions. It's an open source, but what they found is quite remarkable. Consistently, countries that adopt good economic policies do better, regardless of anything else. We have learned This cause of wealth is not oil, it's not land, it's not gold mines, it's institutions. That's why the Netherlands, once a very poor country, became the richest country in Europe in the 17th century. They didn't have gold mines, they did not even have land. If you go to the Netherlands, it's below sea level. They have to make the land. What they developed were good institutions. Hong Kong is another classic example. #1 in economic freedom, extraordinarily high per capita income, a very, very rich city. There's nothing there. It's some big rocks covered by Chinese people. That's it. There's a port, which is valuable, no natural resources, but they had very good economic institutions. You can get the whole report, the most recent 2015, but all of the ones that have come out in the past. Now, Ukraine does not do well in this ranking. So a little bit of honesty. They've divided the quartiles, the top 25%, the next 25%. We don't find Ukraine. We have to go to the third quartile, number 128 in the ranking, in the freedom of doing business and transacting and creating wealth. So Ukraine has a very bad history in this regard and very, very bad economic policies. They rank poorly on everything. If you look where they are, number 67 on side of the government, 100 on the legal system and property rights, 140 on sound money. You all know this. You see the value of the hryvnia falling and falling and falling. This is bad monetary policy. Freedom to trade internationally, 104. It is not easy for Ukrainians or Ukrainian businesses to trade with people in other countries. It's very difficult. The port administration, as we know, staggeringly corrupt, inefficient, and very costly to import or export. The cost of doing business regulation, 138. Credit market regulations, 137. Labor market, 120. 93 on general business regulations, the cost of starting or closing a business. So serious free market reforms are very desperately needed. Last year, on March 12th, with some colleagues, I was involved in the Emergency Economic Summit for Ukraine. I wrote to this gentleman, Kacha Bendukidze from Georgia, in February, and I said, you know, this is a very serious crisis. I don't have the feeling most Ukrainian politicians are focusing on what has to be done. He said, yes, exactly. He was becoming more involved in Ukraine as he saw what was happening. My job was to bring foreign experts. We had former ministers from Slovakia, from Sweden, from Poland, from Latvia, and elsewhere, El Salvador, and Kacha helped to organize the activity here. I remember very clearly what he said. The speakers were very distinguished, senior politicians from other countries and economists. And Einas Repša from Latvia, former prime minister, gave a very elegant speech. Do not print money to get out of the problem. You will just make it worse. And his speech was very elegant. Then Kacha spoke. Some of you heard Kacha speak in the past. He was direct and blunt, and he said in very colorful language, Ukraine is in a bad place. I won't repeat his language, how bad the situation was. And he said, I will repeat one word, he said, your politicians fucked up, pardon me. He said they had 23 years to reform and they didn't do it. And now you have the consequence. You have no choice. And what he said stuck in my mind. Ukraine will have to go through painful reforms to survive, otherwise the country will be lost. It's really a very serious matter. If it isn't done, you will actually lose your country. So this is not an academic exercise. It's a very serious matter of how to save a country. Now it's about institutions. Here's an interesting question. Ukrainians abroad are prosperous. Go to any country where you find Ukrainians. Germany, US, Poland, Canada, UK, Sweden, Australia. They're very prosperous. Don't let anyone tell you the problem is in your hearts or in your minds. Ukrainians everywhere succeed except one country. What country is that? So the problem is here. It's in the institutions. It's not in the mentality. It's not in the heart. It's not in the ability. It's not a matter of intelligence. What can we do to change that? But let me first ask a question about wealth. It matters a lot. Now there's an old truth. If you lack the rule of law, your country will have rich people, but it will not be a rich country. You know there are very, very rich people in Ukraine, unbelievably wealthy. But Ukraine is not a rich country. And that is the difference. You want a rich country, not just a small number of very rich people. Flashy oligarchs and cronies are a sign of a poor country, not of a rich country. They get rich by extracting resources from others, monopolies and privileges. And Ukraine is full of special privileges and monopolies for powerful people. That is the problem. If you want to become a rich country, you have to get rid of the privileges, the things that made those people rich, but made the country poor. And one thing to also clear our minds, go to the rich who confiscated in the country. Look at Yanukovych's house. The whole world got to see it. His elegant, tasteful house. I'm being ironic. Go look at it. Sell it. Sell everything he stole. And you get very little money compared to the population of Ukraine. Those people destroyed much more than they took. Corruption is a negative-sum game. The losses are far greater than the benefits to those who gain from it. So you have been playing a negative-sum game for a long time. And what you need is equality before the law. For every citizen to have the same right to enter the market, to compete with no special privileges, no monopolies for anybody. Everyone should have the same right to enter the market. Adam Smith, in his very important book, changed our understanding of wealth. And it is good to go back and remind ourselves what he told us. His book is called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. There are two elements most people don't pay attention to. The first, what is the nature of wealth? Before Adam Smith, people said a country was rich if the king had a lot of gold and big armies. But Adam Smith said the poor person cannot eat the king's gold. The poor person wants bread on the table, wants a house, medicine, education, all the good things in life. The nature of the wealth of nations is what the people can consume. Any person chosen at random, the most humble person is the nation. And we should be concerned about the wealth of everyone in the nation, meaning what can they consume? Do they have more ability to consume? And then the question, what causes the wealth of nations? And he looked at cases like the Netherlands and other countries, and he pointed out it's not gold in the king's treasury. Mercantilism, the system of privileges for special state-chartered companies, generated gold for some, but it made the population poor. We want a society open where people can create wealth or shared prosperity. So he very radically changed how people think about it. But people have forgotten. And they think Saudi Arabia is a rich country. Saudi Arabia is a poor country. It has very rich parasites. 6,000 princes of the royal family who are total and complete parasites. But the per capita income of the country is lower than Hungary, with all the oil and all the palaces, It's not a rich country. 50% female illiteracy. This is not a rich country. It's a poor country. It would rank quite low in Europe, even taking all of the hundreds of billions of dollars available to all those wealthy parasites from the ruling family. And we find that around the world. Flashy countries like that do not have high incomes for the population. So if we want to ask the question, why nations succeed, that's Adam Smith's question. A book that came out recently asks the reverse side of that question. It's a very interesting book. Why Nations Fail. James Robinson and Darren Acemoglu of MIT look at many case studies. It's a very interesting book. I don't know if Ukrainian or Russian edition is available. I think it's coming. It's really a good book. And they look at cases where governments create cronyism, monopolies, privileges, and they fail when their neighbors succeed. They distinguish between extractive and inclusive institutions. And I'm going to be a bit critical of the book because I think they miss Ukraine's big problem. They describe them as extractive or inclusive, but there's a conceptual confusion such that they don't understand some of the problems Ukraine in particular faces. They talk about inclusive institutions, and I think this is very powerful. They are broadly based, wide democratic participation, and they create an effective state that can support the rule of law. So a government that really can protect you and create a legal system. Inclusive economic institutions, as they say, allow and encourage participation by the great mass of the people in economic activities. There's no monopoly, no caste system that says only people of a certain color or religion or caste can be engaged in the economy. Anyone can join it. Then they contrast with extractive institutions. Extractive political institutions concentrate power in the hands of a narrow elite and place few constraints on the exercise of power. Extractive economic institutions are structured by this elite to extract resources from the rest of society. So they take things from people. The problem with this analysis, although I think it's quite good overall, it's a very serious problem, focuses on what constraints are. The constraints they identify are not democratic or participatory. They're not about voting. Independent judiciary. One of the most important changes that the English brought to the legal system in Europe was judges who cannot be fired when they give a decision the king does not like. The judiciary is independent. Does not mean it's perfect, but it means they are not likely to only be the tools of the rulers. An independent central bank that does not print money when the prime minister wants to boost the economy before the election. Federalism, division of powers, and so on. And here's what they miss. Institutions can be extractive and inclusive or broad-based at the same time. They miss this system. Basically, they miss populism. Populism is a very big problem in Ukraine, but not only Ukraine. I'll talk about some other examples. Frederick Bastiat put it very neatly. The state is the great fictitious entity by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. But of course, this cannot happen. We cannot all be taking from the other person's money to support ourselves. The consequence is we all become poor. George Orwell, in his famous book 1984, described the real ideology of communism. He called it oligarchical collectivism. Collectivism, but run by an oligarchy of privileged people. That's what the book describes very elegantly. Oligarchical collectivism was the real practice of totalitarian states. party members had privileges that non-party members did not have. To shop in special stores, to get better access to a dacha, on and on and on and on. But there's another system, populist cronyism. That's quite common, and most political scientists cannot see it. It's broad-based and participatory, millions of voters and people who think they are benefiting, but it is run by cronies. Mass predation on the middle classes, on so-called plutocrats, economic minorities, and so on. And the pioneers in the 20th century, Juan and Evita Perón. These two people have the distinction of destroying Argentina. Once one of the richest countries in the world, not anymore. Many people who had the choice in 1900, go to the United States or go to Argentina. And they went to Argentina. And their great-grandchildren bitterly regret this choice. Because at one time, rich, advanced country, and destroyed by these people. By Peronism, a kind of participatory fascism that enriched small class of wealthy party elites. The Marcoses in the Philippines, a very popular movement. And most Western political scientists could not understand this man and his wife were extremely popular among the poor. They loved them. They loved the Marcos family. Why? Because Marcos would go to a garbage dump, the poorest, most terrible place in Manila, and he would give everyone there $1. And they remembered it. They said, the president gave me $1, which was a lot of money for these very poor people. But they did not ask, why do I live in a garbage dump? What happened to our country? I live in a garbage dump. The middle classes complained about these people. Imelda, after she was overthrown, they found she owned 5,000 pairs of shoes. It's amazing, very famous story. And they said, you know, we did not care about the shoes, so she liked shoes, whatever. We did not like the mining activities of the Marcos family. You say, really? What mining activities? There are no mines in the Philippines. Oh. These people would go through the country and say, this is mine, and this is mine. They stole everything in the country. There was no property security. But they were extremely popular people who bankrupted an entire nation. In Thailand, the Shinawatras, Thaksin and Yingluck Shinawatra, they promised prosperity through populism. Here's how they did it. Every rice farmer, they said, we will buy all the rice you can grow and we'll pay twice the world price of rice. Farmers thought this sounded good. Why not? My price goes up twice. Well, what happened? This is a sophisticated audience. They grew a lot of rice at twice the world price. The government bought it and went bankrupt. Over 25% of the state budget went only to buy rice. Now they can't sell it. And it led to a low-level civil war in the country, extremely destructive. Populism. By the way, two of the richest people in the country who got their money through corruption, government contracts, government monopolies, and then used it to buy a mass political movement. In Venezuela, once a very wealthy Latin American country, sadly, not anymore. Hugo Chavez and his successor, Chavez died. Maduro is possibly one of the least intelligent figures in Latin American politics, an authentically stupid character. He blames the inflation on neighbors coming and buying all their food. Our problem is food exporting. So they made it illegal to export food. They've essentially destroyed the economy and created very rich people. It's called the Bolivarian movement, Bolivaristas, and people call his friends the Boligarchs. Who is the most wealthy person in Venezuela? His daughter. How did that happen? Amazing. How did that happen, that she is worth over $1 billion US? And another face, and not the only one. I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but these policies have been tried in Ukraine also, with disastrous consequences, following popular leaders who promise everyone will benefit, and the consequence is destruction of the country. Now there's good news. You can undo the damage. Don't be too depressed. In fact, don't be depressed at all. You can change this. You can have democratic, broad-based reforms that make clear promises of shared prosperity, and they can succeed. They need to be politically inclusive and economically inclusive. And I want to give some case studies in a moment. But here's the one thing we have to remember when we do it and explain to people. An open, free economy will have what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. These, I think, are some of the wisest words written in the last century by Schumpeter. He said the problem that is usually being visualized is how capitalism administers existing structures, whereas the relevant problem is how it creates and destroys them. New institutions, new businesses, new products that sweep away the old. A very simple example from my life. When I was a boy, I wanted to be a typewriter repairman. I thought it'd be a great job to repair typewriters. It was a respected, honest profession, and I would always have work. Well, that would have been a bad choice. No one uses typewriters anymore. We use computers. And my computer is a lot better. My first typewriter weighed almost as much as I did. It was very heavy, and I could not watch movies on it. Even if I tried, it would not show movies. And if I talked to my typewriter, people would call the psychiatrist. Now I talk to my computer all the time, and people talk back. It's much better, but it destroyed the typewriter industry completely. There are no more typewriter factories, typewriter repair shops. And oligarchs don't like that because it changes a model that they want to keep still so they can continue to extract money from society. So an open society means one of constant change. And we want business people to always be on their toes. Aware there's competition can take away your competitive advantage. You have to always be on your toes to offer value. You cannot say, I have legal protection. It's illegal to compete with me. So creative destruction is what characterizes a prosperous, dynamic society. Now, some people say, oh, but it's immoral to go into business. Isn't business based on immoral motivations? This is a very common criticism of business and commerce. We hear that economic and market exchanges are immoral, or maybe at best amoral, nothing good or bad about them, that they make people selfish, greedy, materialistic, and uncaring, and so on. And usually in countries in North America or Western Europe, when I hear this, I say, did you ever visit a communist country? No, of course not. They were so loving. I said, really? Not really. Communism helped to undermine institutions of morality and concern for other people. Because if you did not get first in line, you did not eat during the hard times. It did not generate loving, sharing, compassionate people more than other countries. Quite the contrary. We can ask, what about greedy, self-interested behavior? And it's true, self-interest and greed can be very harmful when not constrained by the right institutions. Robbers and thieves, they're greedy. They want what you have, and they take it. That's greed that is harmful. But if it is constrained by the rule of law and respect for the rights of other people, the pursuit of self-interest does not have to be destructive. It can be quite creative. We can also distinguish self-interest from selfishness. It's an important distinction that I think comes through in other languages also. Every person is a self who has interests. But your interests include the success and the health and the happiness of your family, of your friends, of your neighbors, and of your country. Those are interests all of you have that you want to advance. You want your children, husbands or wives, your family, your community to also be happy and healthy. You do not think only about yourself, you think about your interests, which are much wider than ourselves, not the same as selfishness. There's an essay, which is available to all of you in the little book on the morality of capitalism, by a Chinese economist. His name is Professor Mao Yushi. He's a really great thinker, and he is one of the most important figures, Chinese libertarians, who has been promoting for decades China moving in the right direction. He writes a story about the land of gentlemen. He takes seriously the people who are opposed to commerce. He says, let's say they're right. And he describes a classical Chinese story in which a man travels to a country that lives according to the morality of people who are against commerce. No one seeks his own interest, but only the interest of the other person. Someone goes into a store and he says, how much is this? And the fellow says, it's 100 hryvnias. The customer does not care about his interest, but only the interest of the other. He says, 100, it's too little. I will give you 150. The businessman, not caring about his profit, but only the profit of the customer, says, no, you insult me. I will not take more than 75. No, 250, 300, 10. They cannot come to an agreement. If you seek only the interest of other people, you cannot ever come to an agreement with them. But it's when the customer wants the lowest price and the seller wants the highest price, they can find an agreement. And both of them will be happy as a consequence. They will both benefit because of this. Now, at the root of hatred of the market is a fallacy. The idea that if anyone benefits, someone lost. This is not true. This is a very primitive way of thinking of the economy. There can be mutual benefit. Jean-Baptiste Say, French economist, noted that if you do business with other people, it's better if they are wealthy. They can pay more for your product. You should want your trading partners, including other countries, to be prosperous. They can pay more for what you sell. It's in your interest for other people to benefit as well. The mistake is in thinking that any time there's a benefit, there's a loser, or that any time there is a loser, someone must have benefited. Those are false claims. You can have losers without benefits. I'll take a very simple example. Take the countries of the Soviet Union and the other countries that they conquered and impoverished. Let's take a case like Czechoslovakia. It's conquered by Soviet armies and made poor. Did the people in the Soviet Union benefit from that? Is there some wealth to take and compensate the Czechs and Slovaks? No. Everybody lost from that system. There were no gainers in terms of national populations. Everybody lost from that. We can think about it very quickly in terms of payoffs. Everyone thinks about zero-sum payoffs. If there's a gainer, there's a loser. Those almost never happen, only on blackboards and socialist ideologues. These are very rare. Much more common is a negative-sum payoff. The sum of the payoffs is less than zero. Corruption is negative-sum. The people who gain from corruption cause much more harm than the gain. It's a negative-sum game. But then there's also positive-sum games, which the sum of the benefits is greater than zero. That's market exchange. That's voluntary cooperation. Both parties benefit. They get more than they had at the beginning. So the question is how to change negative-sum games, like corruption, into positive-sum games. Wealth creation. That's, in a nutshell, what you face. What you need then is moral ideals, not just practicality. You need political leaders who are willing to lose elections Politicians don't like that, but it's what you need because they do the right thing. You need at least some segment of the population who look to the long term, not only what happens over 6 months or 8 months. What's going to happen in this country in 10 years? That is the question. Who believe in the justice and the practicality of reforms, that these are the right things to do, not only practical. Now, reforms can be implemented, and I want to give some practical case studies. We'll start with New Zealand. 1984 to 1994, it was in a very bad situation. You may not think of it today because of Hobbit movies and prosperous New Zealand. It was the poorest member of the OECD, of industrialized countries, had the lowest rate of economic growth, and a very disastrous economic situation. No reserves in the central bank. It was virtual economic collapse. They had had 8 years of populism, of all kinds of crazy government schemes to create an economy through privileges and populism, and it was a failure. I'll give one simple example. They wanted to create a New Zealand television industry. At the time, televisions were high-tech. We want to be high-tech. We heard a discussion of this yesterday about dirigisme. We'll make high-tech Ukraine. They wanted a high-tech New Zealand. What did they do? They gave special privileges to people to make television sets. And the businessman who did it went to Japan. He bought television sets. Then he paid the Japanese workers to take them apart, import the pieces into New Zealand, and pay New Zealanders to put them back together and sell New Zealand televisions. I think everyone understands this destroyed value. It did not add value. But they said, look, we have a television industry in New Zealand and a car industry, 5 automobile plants producing small numbers of automobiles. But they were bankrupting and ruining the country. These two people changed that. Roger Douglas from the left and Ruth Richardson from the right. The Labour Party and the National Party. Roger Douglas started it. Key reforms. They said no state enterprise will have a monopoly. They liberalized the market. And they said, if you lose money, you lose money. No subsidies for state enterprises. They created private property rights for the fisheries. New Zealand did not export fish, but the fisheries were being rapidly depleted. No more fish. They changed the rules. They instituted property rights. They say you own the right to fish. Well, what's the consequence? It became a substantial fish exporter, and the fish stocks recovered at the same time. Our socialist friends cannot imagine how that's possible, but it's because they got the incentives right through property rights. The State Sector Act of 1988, which changed the relationship between the citizens and the state. Instead of giving money to state bureaus, they said you have a contract with the ministry. You have to produce service, and if you don't, you're all fired. And that dramatically changed the effectiveness of state institutions. Oops. And they instituted an independent central bank with one and only one goal, price stability. That was it. And they signed a contract with the governor of the central bank. If he fails, he's fired. It's not a political institution. The consequence has been quite good. The upper income groups saw their income fall initially as they lost privileges, regain. They've since gone up. But the lowest income groups saw the highest income gains. They opened the economy to anyone. No privileges, no cronies. And the consequence was everyone gained in the long run. But the lowest income groups gained the most. We see this also looking at the various deciles. The lower deciles saw much bigger rises in economic gain. And interestingly enough, in this time period, over 1 million new immigrants to New Zealand. It's a small country, most with nothing. But they've done extremely well in an open economy. Look at Poland. Poland was, when they started the reforms, slightly earlier, because Poland became more democratic before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine had a slightly higher per capita income. Sadly, not anymore. Starting in 1989, they liberalized the economy. No more price fixing. Ukraine has still had price fixing by the state. This is shocking in the year 2015. They created the state-owned companies. They said no subsidies and you have to compete. And later they were privatized. Foreign currencies were allowed with a fully convertible currency. They allowed foreigners to invest on the same terms as Poles. Make profits, keep them in the country, take them out, made it quite open. And they allowed state enterprises to lay off employees. They were simply overstaffed dramatically, and liberalized the labor market so it was easier to hire them. You can find a very interesting comparison of Poland and Ukraine at the Civil Development Forum. Just a few things looking at, this is Ukraine and Poland. Ukraine started much later and did less. On the institutional development, again, Ukraine and Poland, dramatically behind. So Ukraine was slightly ahead in 1990, but did not do the reforms that Poland did. On corruption, here's Ukraine, here's Poland. This has very serious consequences over the long term. And for a country that had higher per capita income in 1990, look at it now. The 2013, this is Poland's 13,829, this is Ukraine's. The country fell dramatically behind as a consequence. It could have been different, but it is not too late. And I'll conclude with Georgia. Some of the key reforms that Saakashvili and Kache-Bendukidze and the Prime Minister Lado Gurganidze, also an important part of this measure, instituted. Tax reform, no one paid taxes in Georgia. They were impossible. They made very simple, clear tax system. Social services, they issued a voucher instead of a state monopoly. They reformed construction permits, made it easier to build new businesses, eliminated visas. You can go to Georgia with no difficult visa, privatized the state firms, privatized agricultural land, and they brought massive investment from New Zealand and Australia and elsewhere in the wine industry, which had collapsed. They outsourced their standards for regulation. They had a complex regulatory bureau to make sure everything was safe for Georgians, and they said, you know, if it's good enough for Swedish people, it's probably good enough for us. So if it could pass the standards of any industrialized country, Japan, Sweden, Germany, it's good enough for Georgia. It lowered the cost of doing business dramatically. They set tariffs at 0 for 95% of categories, made it a substantially free trade zone, and they reduced the number of business licenses from 909 to 159 in one summer. They held up a paper in the cabinet meetings. Here's a license to sell flowers. Do we need that? Anyone? Is there a reason to make people pay bribes to sell a flower? No. Eliminate it. And most of these are business construction permits where there is some reason the building, you have to show it will not fall on the next door building, for example. It has to be a sound building. Otherwise, you want to go into business, you don't have to ask permission. You just do it. Find willing customers. And they even privatized water and railroad systems. Now you can find case studies of this at the Antigua Forum, which has been developing case studies of liberalization. One on New Zealand that's quite good. One on Georgia by Larissa Burakova and Robert Lawson. Also, I should point out Larissa's book is available in Russian language, a very careful study of the Georgian reform process. And the one on, from the Civil Development Forum in Poland, comparing Poland and Ukraine. You can get at this website. So this is more material for you to study on your own. So a few lessons, and I'll conclude with this. Number one, get all the liberal reform you can get as fast as you can get it. Do not think we have a 12-year program. It won't happen. This is part of Ukraine's problem. If you phase in the reforms, they will fail. Get as much as you can now. When you take away privileges, give freedom at the same time. This is a very important element. If you merely allow businesses to release employees, we call redundant, too many employees, but you don't free the labor market, they'll be unemployed. Free the labor market so people can find work. In New Zealand, the farmers were protected and subsidized. They took away all the subsidies and all the protection. And it was hard for 2 years for farmers, no question. But at the same time, they said, you are free to buy anything from the rest of the world. Agricultural machinery, tractors, you don't have to pay 3 times the world price. Because of tariffs, you can just buy it. Now, New Zealand farming is extremely profitable. They export all over the world high-quality products. They don't produce for the state, they produce for the market. And they add the highest value. Extremely successful agricultural sector. You need to explain to the public clearly what are the benefits and what are the costs. Have an open discussion, and I think that's where you come in. You talk to your friends at the dinner table, at school, with your grandparents, and discuss these things about the future of the country. It's over the dinner table that a lot of these things will happen. You need, Kacha said, 3 people. Someone who can manage the political coalition, a very clever, skilled politician. Someone who will explain it to the public and take ownership of this publicly. And someone who's willing to be hated because he took away everyone's privilege. Kacha said, that was me. Everybody hated me in Georgia. He said, when I would go to work, I would walk down the street. He was very easy to recognize, a very big man. If someone said, good morning, Kacha, I would stop and say, what did I do wrong? This person does not hate me. There's some privilege I have not taken away. What was it? Ruth Richardson. Everyone hated her. And Roger Douglas in New Zealand. Now they're quite popular figures because everyone saw the consequences for prosperity. But at the time, they were unpopular. But they did what was right because they had the moral courage to do it. About sequencing and timing. A lot of economists talk about optimal sequencing. And the actual reformers will tell you it's useless. It's useless. This happens in political reality, not in a laboratory or a classroom. And so people like Joseph Stiglitz, useless in my opinion. He gives academic advice, but not practical advice. Get all the reform you can, the window of opportunity will close. And you have a window now, but it will not be there for a long time in Ukraine. But one thing you should get right, first, as they did in Poland and New Zealand and Georgia, liberalize the market and allow competition. No monopolies. That's the key. Then privatize state assets. You don't want to privatize a monopoly. This was a big problem in Mexico. They privatized Telmex, the state telephone monopoly, to this man, Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, Mexican oligarch. Now he spends his money protecting his monopoly. And unsurprisingly, telephone prices in Mexico are much higher than any other country in the region because there's no open competition. So first liberalize the market, let anyone compete, then if there's a state entity, privatize it, but don't privatize a monopoly. So you need to be idealistic and realistic at the same time. Know that what you do is right, it is just, it is good for the country. You are willing to be attacked, insulted, your morality questioned, because you do what is right for your country. And realistic, reforms that will actually work, and not simple dreams or fantasies. So I'll conclude, the future of the country is in your hands. And if you are not idealistic, you will lose it. But you need to be practical and realistic at the same time. What works, what can be implemented, how to do it. But don't lose your idealism. Because if you do, you'll lose your country. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, yeah. By the way, you can find this book, Morality of Capitalism, in your flashcard, which every of you have in your Free Generation Forum pocket package. So we have about 10 minutes for your questions. You can ask it in every language. Yes, I see.
Hello, my name is Christina, and you talked about long-term visions for country. But if to talk about everybody of us, every citizens, so we have a dilemma: should we live for today and enjoy life, or should we think for tomorrow and do something to live better sometimes in the future? So now a question: what can everybody of us do, and what is the right point of view, and what is our role in transformation processes in Ukraine? Thank you.
I think you know the answer to your question. So you can spend your time at discotheque or partying, and that's okay. Life needs some of that. You need to live for today also. But you can also be thinking about the future of your country, so that it will be the one country you want to live in, you would like to see your children grow up in. What needs to be done in that context then? First, educate yourself about successful reforms and good economic policy. That's the first place. Become educated. And our colleagues have presented a lot of literature. This is open-minded, not indoctrination. Think about it, question, challenge. Number two, talk to your friends about it and your families. And here's one of the most important things. There's a generational gap in Ukraine. People who are accustomed to the old system, and they have difficulty with change. This happens when you get older. Someday I will experience it myself, I'm sure. What to do? Talk to your grandparents about the future of the country and why it is important to do this so their grandchildren will have a future. And that might mean changes that are uncomfortable. It also means the state is bankrupt. Let's just face that. The Ukrainian state has been bankrupted. It's broke. You go to the penny bank and you break it, there's nothing in it. Well, I think that means that for people who are in need, people who suffer, elderly people who relied on state pension, to create social networks to help them. Institutions to help people who are in need, that are not the state, not going here to Kiev, say, give us money, but to help people who need help. Voluntary civil action. That's a part of saving the country, so that there will be a civil society. And we have seen that in Ukraine. It's a very, very good thing to watch, particularly in the areas that have been very hurt by the military conflict, that there are people who have come out and brought food and assistance to people who are suffering and very vulnerable. The other final thing is political action. I'm not a political person per se. I don't recommend this party or that party, but get active in demanding that political leaders and parties promote policies that make sense, not fantasy promises to everyone. Everyone's going to have a free aquarium, or we're all going to get all kinds of benefits from the state, but realistic policies and challenge politicians in the party you may be in, if you're in a party, or politicians who are running publicly. And I'll use a harsh word, Kache Bendukidze's favorite word in English. He said, don't talk bullshit to me. And it needs to be said to Ukrainian politicians, enough bullshit. Talk realistic. What's going to work in this country? Not populism, not promises of everything. What's going to work? Tell us what it's going to be. That's a very important job for you as a citizen. And as I said, when you do it, don't become so cynical. Keep your morality, keep your ideals, and hold to them.
More questions? Yeah, I see.
Name is Mika. You failed to address the fundamental premise of sovereignty and liberty. And to put it in other terms, he who owns the gold makes the rules. It's about currency issue. How come you have not addressed that?
In the context of currency reform, there's something that's ideal and untested, and there are some practical things that are maybe not ideal, but are an improvement. And the New Zealand case is a good case in point. I think that we should get the state out of the money business altogether. That's my moral ideal. In the short term, what they did in New Zealand was, one, allow people to own any foreign currency. They got rid of all the capital and currency controls. They went to the central bank and they said, you have one job. They restructured it. It was no longer a political bank subject to control by Ministry of Finance or Treasury. They created it and they made a contract. They said, your job is to maintain price stability, and that's all. In contrast, the US Federal Reserve has two mandates that are not really compatible, so-called full employment and price stability. It turns out those pull in opposite directions. In New Zealand, they gave them one mandate only, and the head of the New Zealand Central Bank had the power to hire and fire staff economists and bankers, and could be fired if he or she failed to meet the contract. The consequence has been much better monetary performance of a stable purchasing power not manipulated for political purposes. And I think that's a good thing. Is it the best? No. Not in my opinion. One can do better, and I tend to favor so-called free banking or denationalization of money. I think it's important to move in that direction, but I wouldn't make the best the enemy of an improvement. And Ukraine has had really terrible monetary performance in this country. The monetary institutions have failed fundamentally. One can do better, and I think that reforms, even short of the ideal, that move in the direction of the ideal would be an improvement. But it is a case in which the ideal of decoupling the state from money, I think, should be kept in our minds. That money should not be a tool of politicians, which is what it has been traditionally.
More questions? Yep, and yes.
My name is Andrei. I have a question about China economist. Is this man part of China establishment, or maybe this man dissident? I mean, this man can write to official press in China, or maybe this man dislocated in Taiwan, for example.
There's a very interesting history. Uni-Rule Institute is the institute he founded. And they are an independent private think tank in China. Professor Mao is a person of great courage. I admire him immensely. He's a Chinese gentleman. He was arrested in 1954 under the purge against the rightists and sent to labor camp. He was sent to labor camp in the Great Leap Forward and nearly died of starvation. 45 million Chinese people died in a 3-year period. It was really quite comparable to Ukraine, but in a bigger country, forced starvation of the population. He was arrested during the Cultural Revolution, and finally, after Mao died, he began to talk publicly. His first arrest was for writing in his private diary, if there is no pork in the market, they should let the price rise. So, and for that thought crime, he was sent to prison. He has promoted very strongly moving in the direction of more freedom as a private person. He's not a state official. Uni-Rule Institute works in a Chinese context. You have to be rather more discreet because the state will punish you if you directly challenge them. But as an example of what they did, the model that Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping are promoting of state crony capitalism, they say, look how successful it is. And they hold up the state enterprises as models of success, state-owned enterprises in China. Uni-Rule Institute got the data, and they said this is not true. State-owned enterprises receive cheap subsidized credit. They pay half the interest rate of private enterprises. And they receive subsidized electricity and subsidized natural gas and oil. If you take that into account, it's a major study that they did, you see these are loss-making enterprises across the board. They're sucking money out of the productive economy in China. This was quite bold. It may not sound like it, but in China, they challenged the most powerful people in the country who benefited from this. And they have had a tremendous impact. They also stand up for humble people who are being oppressed. They believe in property rights for peasants. One of the other think tanks called Transition Institute, Guo Yushan, was in prison for some time and only recently released because he stood up for the rights of simple farmers who were confiscated by powerful people and local Communist Party officials. So these are quite noble people. They have a different context in China. You can say roughly what you want in China except one thing. Do not criticize the political leaders, they will crush you. And do not criticize the monopoly of the Communist Party. For this, you'll go to prison. Setting those constraints, our friends in China are pushing very hard for more free and just and open society. And Professor Mao is, to me, a model of how one does that in that dictatorial context.
Next question? Yeah.
Darius, thanks, Tom, for a very insightful presentation. I assume and I understand you know Ukrainian situation really well and you follow how events unravel. So I just want to ask you, because you showed those presentations with case studies of New Zealand and other countries. Let's imagine we have Ukraine presentation there, Ukraine slide. We have your picture on the left side and we have 3 bullet points to put on the right side. And you have 3-4 months as a PM to do something concrete. What will those be? And can you please avoid broad answers like increasing, wealth, income, but straight to the point, very concrete, 3 to whatever suggestions you have in mind. Thank you.
It's a complex question because Ukraine is so complicated. I don't know as well as I do New Zealand or places like that. But a few things. Really free prices to tell the truth. Energy subsidies and so on have been a catastrophe. Prices should be free to tell the truth, and they have not been for a very long time in Ukraine. The stabilization funds brought in from European Union that were deposited in the budget, don't use them to keep subsidizing a broken system. If you're going to take them, use them to subsidize the elderly grandmother who has difficulty paying her electricity bill because it rose. But the electricity bill should rise to what the market is. And if some people are suffering, give that money to them to pay the bill. But do not subsidize and push down the bill. This is a catastrophe, and it's been done by one Ukrainian government after another. Let the prices tell the truth about supply and demand. That's one important thing. Second thing is really go in and smash the monopolists. And it means standing up to some very powerful people in the country. Look at the case of the port system in Odessa and the airport, Mr. Kolomoisky and the various privileges. They don't like losing their privileges. We know that. But it has to be done. And it has to be done for 2 reasons. One, really open the economy to new entrants. And 2, demonstrate the fairness of this. That privileges for the powerful will no longer be tolerated. And that is very important to generate widespread understanding that you're not just creating another phony reforms that will benefit a small group of people. So that means get rid of their privileges, get rid of their monopolies, and do so very, very directly. I think that there needs to be fundamental reform at the central bank, which I think needs to be put on the kind of basis that was done in New Zealand. They have one goal and one goal only, and that's price stability. And if they fail to meet it, you fire them all. Macroeconomic stabilization on that level, I think, is quite important. So those are a few of the things that I think need to be done. The other thing I would do in an economy that has so many permits and requirements is what they did in Georgia. Make a list of them. They had 909. Go through the list and just say, get rid of this one, get rid of this one, get rid of this one. So if you have 2,000 permits here in Ukraine, you should have a goal. You would like to get down to 200 maximum. and just abolish them. No one should have to pay for a fee to open a business. It should just be simple and easy. Last thing, something that has been experimented with, to reduce the actual incidence of corruption, move as many state functions as you can online. Because computers, so far, cannot be programmed to demand bribes. This may happen, but not yet. And when countries have done that, they reduce the interaction between you and the bureaucrat, they reduce the opportunity to extract resources from you. So those are a few very concrete things. Feasible, doable. The hardest one that will take the most political will is standing up to the oligarchs and say, we're going to eliminate your privileges and allow anyone to compete. But it has the benefit, it tells the population you're serious about fairness. And I think that has an additional political benefit. We're about out of time.
Unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you will continue to work with our colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Сейчас у нас по плану.
Now we have a lunch break. It's very important to come back at 2 o'clock sharp because Viktor Pezenik's lecture will start on time at 2 o'clock. For those who just joined us today, in your leaflets at the back, on the last page, you have the map of places you can have lunch around Federal Hub. And we wait in half an hour. Thank you.